Thank you all for coming in such big numbers today. I'm delighted to see so many people here. How many of you, just show up, how many of you are from philosophy, psychology, poli-sci, or IR? Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. Kristen Renwick Monroe is a professor of political science and philosophy at UC Irvine. She's the author of a number of really groundbreaking books in social science, having to do broadly with the concerns of ethics, of an important book on altruism and why people would act altruistically. Today's lecture will be more on the other end of that spectrum, why some people act abominably, but also others act well. Her work on ethics has, as I said, influenced a number of disciplines in the social sciences. I remember this summer I was at a conference, the American Political Science Institute meeting, and I asked an old friend from Northwestern University if she'd read any good books lately. And she said, well, you came to the right place. I was on an APSA Book Award committee this year. I've read 80 books on European politics in the last couple of weeks. And let me tell you which one I enjoyed the most. And she proceeded to tell me about the book about which we're to hear today, Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide, a book from Princeton University Press in 2012. In addition to this book, Professor Monroe has written about a dozen other books and 50-some articles. She's been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, for a National Book Award, and she's won a basket full of awards from her various disciplines in which she labors. We're delighted to have her here today. We're delighted that you're here, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming to campus Professor Kristen Renwick Monroe.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I have kind of a small voice. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to apologize in advance because we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. I am not very good at this, so I have done a lot of videotapes, and I have some of them embedded here, and sometimes they play well and sometimes they don't. The book I want to talk about today is the end of a trilogy, and I really got interested in this book because of a puzzle. I started out as a rational choice theorist, somebody that believes that human behavior is the product of rational calculations of self-interest. And I thought, well, collective behavior, collective action, which is what much of political science is, and altruism don't fit into that model. So I tend to be a very efficient person. I thought, well, there's less altruism. I'll look at that, and then I'll kind of clean that up, and then I can go on to collective action. That was in 1988, and I'm still kind of looking at altruism, trying to figure out what it can tell us about human behavior. As part of that book, I interviewed people who were entrepreneurs as kind of typical rational actors, and then people who were philanthropists, people who got in the Carnegie Hero Commission Award, and people who rescued Jews during the Holocaust. And I sent the book off, and I kind of moped around the house for about a week, and I think it was just really hard to say goodbye to the people I'd interviewed. And I thought about it, and I realized that the rescuers in particular were very compelling. So I wanted to try to understand what it was that made people willing to risk their lives and those of their families, which is a pretty extreme case of altruism. So I did a book called The Hand of Compassion, which is about the rescuers. And those two books, Heart of Altruism and The Hand of Compassion, had suggested to me that if you really want to understand altruism, you have to understand how people see themselves in relation to other people, that our sense of ourselves in relation to other people sets a kind of identity that sets and delineates the range of choice options that we find available, not just morally, but cognitively. We just don't think about certain things. So that, for example, well, we'll get into some of the examples later. So then I wanted to know whether or not what I found with the rescuers and with altruists was part of something that was just unique to them, or whether or not it was a type of behavior that everybody did. And so I thought, well, I'll look at other people during the Holocaust. I had a couple students who said their families were German. They came, and I talked with them about the Holocaust and what they had done then. And I was struck, as just for my own edification, I spoke with people who had lived during that time period, and I realized that the rescuers and the bystanders would say phrases which were very similar. So the first phrase is, "But what else could I do? They were human beings like you and me." And that was to explain why they would risk their lives for somebody. The bystanders would say, "But what could I do? I was one person alone against the Nazis." neither set of people felt that they had a choice. But what else could I do? But what could I do? And they were human beings like you and me. I was one person alone against the Nazis. Both descriptions were accurate, and yet they gave them vastly different behaviors. So I was trying to understand what this was all about. So that's really why I did the book that I did, the last part of the trilogy. So I just breeze through this. My kids help me with PowerPoints because I don't know how to do things. I had a wonderful PowerPoint that my daughter had put together. It had beautiful colors, and I was giving it at a talk at Trinity College, Dublin. And I asked her if she could fix it up, meaning that because it was a little dark, and I wanted her to pull down the bright pinks. And she said, yes, she'd done it. And so I got up in front of about 200 people. The first 3 slides were fine. And then the 4th slide, letters came flying in and going like this. And everybody's long forgotten what I said, but they always remember Chloe's PowerPoint. So we're very dependent on you for help sometimes. And let me just give you a little background. If you look at the literature on genocide, you have kind of macro level explanations. Genocides tend to happen when there have been wars, such as the breakdown after World War I, or the breakdown of Yugoslavia, the breakdown of the Soviet Union, political regimes, economic depression. The Holocaust fits into this. There are lists. And the second level of factors are kind of what we call socio-political factors. You have a totalitarian regime, usually. Genocides don't usually happen in a democracy. There's a lack of a free press. There's no effective political opposition. Again, the Holocaust is an example of this. And then the micro level, you can get into the individual psychology of the participants. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So I'm not saying that the others aren't important factors in terms of explaining genocide, but I'm just focusing on the individual level. So here are the questions that I'm interested in. What causes ordinary people to become killers? Because most of the people who were involved in the Holocaust they weren't anything that would set them apart as being psychopaths. And then secondly, what makes bystanders different from supporters, or perpetrators, and from rescuers? And then finally, what causes some people to risk their lives and those of their families to save people that are strangers? So what I'm going to try to do, if we can, is play some of the videos that I have. I have some videos of survivors, and the survivors are important because they were there. One of the questions that you ask yourself if you interview people 40 years after an event happened is whether or not something called X set them on this route, which then made them look in a certain way, and 40 years later you go back and they all look the same way, and so you say it's Y which causes it when actually it was X. But if the survivors, people who were there at the time, say exactly the same thing, which you do, which is that it was identity, and I have a slide I probably won't be able to play, a man named Emmanuel Tenet, and I always think he's interesting. He was 6 years old when the Holocaust started. He was Polish. He's now a psychiatrist who was in Michigan for most of his life, now is retired to Florida. And I always wonder what one of my kids would have done if they'd been 6 or 7 and suddenly had no one to take care of them at all. And he said that these were not people who were making choices under reflection. These were people who did it because that's simply the kind of person they were. They really didn't have a choice, which is basically the same conclusion that I reached. So it makes me feel better that my answer is accurate because he was there at the time. I'm going to try to play a tape on that gives you the context for action. And I want to talk about the importance of bystanders in this process. And then there's a quote by Elie Wiesel who says, there's always a second when the moral choice is made. And I want to challenge this because I think this is a traditional approach in philosophy and social science and literature, the idea that there's a moral reflection, the hero paces the floor through the dark night of the soul, and as the sun comes up in the east, he decides to do the right thing. And that's just not the way it was for these people at all. The second book is called The Hand of Compassion because it's from a quote from a German who was living in Czechoslovakia during the war, therefore could have benefited a great deal by the Nazis, but refused to take any benefits and saved over 100 people before he was put in concentration camp himself. And he said, in explaining his actions, the hand of compassion was faster than the calculus of reason. It was a very spontaneous kind of thing. So let's see if we can, I don't know if we can play this one or not. We'll see. Okay.
Some killed, others helped the killers, or made believe that they didn't know. The large majority was apathetic, unconcerned, uninvolved, indifferent. And the victims died not only because of the killers, they died because of the indifference of the others. Let us not forget, after all, that there's always a second when the moral choice is made. Even in those times when the dictatorship, the police, the terror were unprecedented. German soldiers everywhere, collaborators everywhere. Even then there were people, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, who simply said, no, we won't do it. We'll open the door, we'll take in someone and help. So it is possible for the human being, alone, often alone, to say no to death.
So I wanted to kind of set the context because we're in a nice, wonderful classroom in a pretty, very safe area. This is not what it was like for the people who are facing these choices. So this is, I'm going to try to play this one if we can. This is Emmanuel Tenet, and he talks about character, not choice, being relevant. I don't know if this is going to, not sure how. Okay, we're not going to get that one. Okay, I'm going to hit. We'll go on. I have a limited number of times, so I don't want to go back and forth too much. I'm sorry they're not playing. The main themes I want to alert you to in The Rescuers, what made Rescuers different? There are a lot of themes that you can use to explain it. A lot of them said they did it out of duty. A lot of them talked about role models. My father would tell me to help an old woman carry her bags, things like that. A lot of times it was socialization. You were taught in school certain things. A lot of times it was religion. That was a factor that was very important for a lot of people. Sometimes there were just innate predispositions. There was a woman I actually interviewed in Salt Lake City named Alida Prague, who I could figure out nothing in her background that predisposed her to it. In her situation, she had 7 children of her own. She had her husband had been laid off work because he'd taken part in some anti-Nazi activities. And her children said they didn't understand at the time. They didn't have enough food themselves, but they always had strangers in the house. And the daughter said, my mother explained to me, if people want to kill these people, and if we don't help them, they will die. And so the little girl cut her apple in half, her birthday apple, and gave it to her. Very sweet. There are lots of explanations that they gave me when I asked them why they did it, but what was never offered and what was really striking for me as a rational choice theorist, trained to think of how people make choices, is choice. People never mentioned it. They never said that they had a choice to make. It was always, what else could I do? They were human beings like you and me. And some of them would get mad at me. I said to one woman, I go off to a lot of conferences where there are a lot of economists, and she talked about how good it made her feel to help people. And I said, well, the economist will say, well, yes, she was doing it to buy something for herself. And the woman interrupted me and said, oh, that's very cynical. What goes around comes around, yes, but that's not why you do it. And I thought that was a very good answer. What I want you to be sensitive to is what I call the ethical perspective, the perspective that they bring to view the world, and the sense of moral salience, that an issue that someone else's suffering is relevant for me. It isn't just that, we all know, everybody's reading in the papers what's happening in the Philippines, how many people are dead, how many people are suffering. I won't ask how many people have sent money. If it were someone in your hometown, you'd be mailing money. So why is it that sometimes someone's suffering, you feel bad about it, you may even want to give a little money, but you're not really going to put yourself out too much to do it? So you have to feel that somebody else's suffering is relevant. So there's a kind of sense of moral salience. Character is important, but character is not all. Their critical aspect of character and identity, I think, is relational. It's how you see yourself in relation to other people. And so I have a couple slides I want to show you that show the self-image, the worldview, and how they categorize other people in relation to them. For those of you who have seen Hotel Rwanda or have read anything about that, they referred to the other people as cockroaches. The cockroaches are coming. And that's very much what the Nazis did. They referred to people as vermin. The Jews, the Gypsies, the homosexuals, the Slavs. I mean, there's a whole category of people that were, they called them Untermenschen, subhuman. And so there's a kind of distancing, categorization. And the way I actually helped understand this was my daughter. I was pregnant when I was doing one of these books. I was reading about the German health officials, and they were having debates over what to do with these people. Do we put them in a ghetto and let them die naturally of starvation because they were being kept on a diet of about 330 calories a day? Or do we be more humane and kill them off immediately? That's considered more humane. So I was reading these articles, book about this debate, and I'm sitting there with a book balanced on my belly since I'm about 7 or 8 months pregnant, and my husband comes out and he's picking up snails. We just moved to Irvine. If any of you are from Southern California, you know that yards don't grow, they come on trucks. Everything is kind of man-made there. And so we'd put in a lot of marigolds and zinnia, which apparently snails really love. So it was, a happy time at the Lampros Monroe household. So he's picking up the snails and putting them in a plastic bag, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I don't want to put out snail bait because the baby may, when she comes, will be crawling around, and we don't want her to have a poison, but this will get rid of the snails." And I heard myself say, "Oh, just put them out of their misery right away. That's so cruel to let them suffocate." And then I thought, oops. So I said, "Can we talk about this?" So we decided we'd just let the snails go, and we would plant other flowers. So fast forward about 2 years. My daughter's now 2. I come home from school one day, and she's in the back in the family room, which has glass doors out onto the patio where I was sitting before when my husband's collecting the snails, and she has brought all her little snail friends in, and they're having snail races up the glass doors. And I said, "What are you doing? These slimy, disgusting things in my house." And she said, "I'm having races with my friends." And I said, "Okay." And then at bedtime that night, I said, we should go up to bed. And so she goes over and she pulls a snail off, and I said, "I don't think that's a good thing to do." "Why not?" I said, "Well, you know how dogs can get germs from people? I mean, maybe snails could get a disease." Okay, this is what's known as mommy talk, right? So she put the snails back up, and I said, snails like cold weather at night, so it's possible that they might get out during the night. So the snails were gone the next day. Okay, so zoom up a little forward. My daughter's now 9. She has a science project. She decides to do it on whether or not snails like to walk on grass, wood, or concrete better. So we're trying to find snails. I'm taking my precious walk time to find snails. There are no snails in January in Irvine. You cannot buy snails in a pet store, only underwater snails. So I managed to find 4 snails, which have now become very precious to me. And so we use those, and you will not be surprised to know that snails, it's not like the scientific experiment here, let's go. They just kind of do whatever they want to do. They seem to maybe like grass better, but it was not a really good experiment. So she is writing it up, and her dad has a business dinner, and he comes home. I've been helping her with the report. And he comes in, "Hi, how was your dinner, Daddy?" "Fine." "What did you have to eat?" "Escargot." So I said, we have in this room a perpetrator, a rescuer, and I'm now a bystander. Okay, so what's the point of telling this story? Okay, it's that through affection for another person, I saw the humanity in the snails. I wasn't going to let her kiss him goodnight. I wasn't going to encourage him to, have snail pets that would sleep on the bed the way our cats do. But I could see that I was no longer going to crush the snails. My husband hadn't gotten to that point. He was happy to eat the things for dinner. So this is one of the things that I took out of it, that the dehumanization, the recategorization, you can turn it back the other way, and so you can show people the humanity in other people. So let me just try to show you a few slides which talk about this. I'm not going to play all of them. Let's see if this is one we can get.
I think that we all have memories of times that we should have done something and we didn't. And it gets in your way during the rest of your life.
This is a woman who was about your age. She was 18 during the war. She was in Holland. She saw them throwing a bunch of Jewish children from an orphanage on a truck to take away to camp. Some Dutch women tried to fight them off, and they were thrown on too. And she said, I didn't do anything, but I decided then if I could do something, I would. And so she saved a lot of people later. And I think she highlights the relationship between identity and action. A lot of psychologists, there's some psychology majors here you know about cognitive dissonance, which if you say you're a good person and yet you consistently cheat on an exam or steal money, after a while you kind of have to think about that because it undermines your self-image. So there's very important for these people. I say I'm a good person. I want to help other people. There was a group in southern France in a town called Le Chambon where the minister stood up and said, this has nothing to do with politics. We just can't turn in our Jewish brothers and sisters. And so it was what they call a contagion of goodness in that area. They would all save people. So I think that there's a kind of system where your behavior and your identity feed back into each other. Okay. One of the people you're going to see is a man named John Widener. He was on the Gestapo's most wanted list for organizing an escape network that took Jews from Holland and Belgium through France to Switzerland and Spain. He was kind of a larger-than-life person. He escaped 5 times from the Gestapo. The interview that you'll see with him, it's a little hard to understand because he was beaten so badly around his head. He had to have 2 operations afterwards. And I'm just going to ask you, for all of you who've seen James Bond movies, this is obviously somebody who did great things like that. What do you think somebody like this would do after the war in his professional life? What kind of job would he have? What? Philosophy? No, he was a owned a health food store in Pasadena, which I always think is, 007 after he retired or something. Okay, so this is a long tape, so I'm not going to play all of it. But he talks about the complexity of the moral life. He says it's many factors that come into it. He was a deeply religious man. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. He talked about socialization. And then he said that he didn't do anything that was special. And then he talks about what it means, which is what all the rescuers said. They insisted they hadn't done anything extraordinary. And one man said, as did a lot of them, I only did what any decent person would be. And I finally said, how can you say that? You know that nobody else is doing it. You know that there are laws and there are thousands of people being rounded up and killed. If everybody did it, and he said, well, they would do it if they really had the opportunity. So they didn't think of what they did as anything unusual, which was really extraordinary for me. And then he talks about what psychologists call an idealized cognitive model. What is it that you think means to be a human being? And we'll see that in a tape contrasting him with a rescuer, a bystander. And so I'm just going to alert you to the worldview. They viewed life as a gift, and therefore it was a trust. It's something, and when they say things like, I've been very lucky, and then they wouldn't go on and describe, having a brilliant career or a lot of money. They'd say, I have the gift of sight. I have the gift of hearing. I can speak. Therefore I have particular obligations because I was given these gifts, which I thought was very interesting. Privilege brings responsibility, but the privilege that they saw were things that everybody has. So it was a trust. Life was very sacred to them. In the book, I did what I called targeted interviews. I found people to match each other. I started out with a Dutch rescuer named Tony, who was 19 when the war started, and he lived in hiding for most of the war because he was involved right away in some activities that were anti-Nazi. His cousin Beatrix mother died when Beatrix was quite young, and Beatrix was raised by Tony's mother. So you have a genetic similarity, you have socialization similarity, but she was a bystander. She knew what Tony was doing, but she didn't do anything herself. There's a Dutch Nazi propagandist named Fritz. And then there's Kurt, who was a soldier for the Nazis. It was definitely a racist. He didn't tell me too much about his own personal about whether or not he belonged to the Nazi Party. I didn't ask people. I tried not to push. And then the last person I interviewed was a woman named Florentine, who was married to one of the top 2 Dutch Nazis and was a sister of the head of the Dutch SS. And we can talk about her later. She was really a trip and a half. This is Tony, Beatrix the rescuer, and he says the way he classified people, he says we're all human beings. I don't know if this will play or not. We can see. No. Okay, I'm not going to flip back and forth. We'll just... Tony's worldview said we need to create new moralities that are based on love and caring and the knowledge that we're all the same. Worldview is much more important than socio-demographic characteristics. He said we're all sons of God. If you think about it, therefore we're all the same. If everybody would work together, nobody would be killed. And he said, when I asked him about why you rescued Jews, he stopped me and said, I was rescuing people. It wasn't that they were Jews necessarily. It was that they were people who needed help. So he saw everybody as being the same. And this was typical of rescuers, where you and I would see a stranger, a rescuer just sees another human being. It's just that they were people. And then you can contrast him with Beatrix in terms of the worldview. And so I'm going to play, I hope I'm going to play 2 brief clips. One is an interview with, a couple interviews with Beatrix, who was Tony's cousin, and she was married to a doctor. They got the house from the doctor and the practice. She's a little vague on what happened to the doctor. He went someplace, I think maybe Africa. Well, of course he was Jewish. He had to leave. So she, it's like the beginning of Schindler's List, where you see the people being thrown out, and then Schindler comes in and takes over the apartment. And she didn't think that there was anything odd about the fact that they got this business, this beautiful home. She talks about being very lucky. She always had a good life. I had servants. I had money. I had leisure time to play tennis. And then we'll contrast that with both her cousin and with some other Dutch rescuers. I have a clip by John, who talks about how happiness comes from making other people happy. So let's see if I can play this now. I hope. Maybe.
Always 2 servants. One for the cooking and one for the serving. And I too, I've been my whole life very... Wat is verwend? Well, I had a very good life. I always had servants and...
very affluent.
Verwend, what is
affluent? Well,
means
a fair bit
spoiled.
of money and material goods.
Yes, but, well, my husband worked very much. But I had time to go and play tennis and play squash and all sorts of things. And I had two helps in the kitchen, and I had one help for his practice too.
Oh.
At that time you did.
I don't speak much Dutch, and what she said actually means spoiled. I translated it as affluent, but she's saying she was very spoiled. So now let's see if we can get John in contrast to her. He's a rescuer. Come up. Nope. Okay, I'm going to have to try to do something a little tricky for me. Let's see now. Whoops. What did I do? I went back. Okay. Oops. I'm not sure where John is, but let me show you some more. Oh, here's John. There's John. I'm not sure. One's real long. Well, this is it? Okay, good. Thank you.
What does it mean to be a human being to you?
I mean that I have some privileges who obligated me to some responsibilities. I received from God sightseeing, speech, hearing. I can walk around. I'm thankful for what I have. And so I want to share with others. My responsibility is to share with others. Even because life will not be possible. And I have seen in my life that people are selfish, who are not happy. I see people are unselfish and they were happy. I've seen people who are selfish, that have power and money and everything, and they had not enough. And never had enough. And unhappy because they had not enough. And other people are not very much. They were happy what they had, and they were happy. So if my ambition and my aim is to be happy, and I think the ambition of everyone, then how can you be happy? There's a question, how? Is to be selfish? And I say people are just thinking about themselves all the time, they aren't happy.
You would not have been happier if you had simply taken all of your family, gone to Switzerland, sat out the war in Switzerland, and after the war you could have said, at least my family is intact, I love them, I've been a good person, I haven't done anything wrong. You would not have been happier than what you did?
You have not only to do what is not right, you have to do what is right.
It's not enough.
More than yourself. You have to think about yourself. Certainly, you have to eat and to clean, and my wife is sure home and everything and so. But it is not concentrate on that. It's not my aim. It is not my goal. Myself. I. And you see, and all they see around me, what they see around me is that people are really happy. I've seen people, Salvation Army people, how happy they are. They sing and they're happy and so. Why? Because they're helping.
So
And they see around me, I see a lot of people very rich, but they don't have enough. They want more and more power.
Are you saying that happiness comes through helping other people?
I think so. I'm convinced of that. Real happiness. And I see it around me. I see it for myself. I'm really happy if I can make other people.
So you see, that's a very different kind of attitude and worldview than Beatrix had. Okay, now, go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, let me show you a couple other interviews with Beatrix. This is very painful for me to watch. I've watched it many times. It's still difficult. There are 3 different clips. She raises the issue of what happened to the Jews. I was, in one hand, not a very good interviewer. I never went for the jugular. There were a lot of questions I wanted to ask. John's sister, for example, had been killed as a result of his activities, and he told me about that, how difficult it was. That's why I asked him the question about taking your whole family and going to Switzerland. But Beatrice raised the issue, so I asked her about it. So these, I'm not sure exactly what sequence they're in. I apologize if they're a little out of sequence, but it's interesting to see.
Know what was going on? What was your impression of what was happening with the Jews during the war?
Yes, I knew.
Did you? What did you think was the situation for the Jews? You said a lot of them that you knew went to Africa. The man who sold your husband
Yes,
in practice went to Africa.
and they went to a camp north in the neighborhood of Sertogenbos. I can't say the name. I knew it. And
What kind of camp was it?
well, there was no gas, but they had a very bad life.
It was a work. So you thought it was a work camp?
Yes,
Basically.
they had to work.
Did you know about the concentration camps during the war?
Yes,
You
we
did.
knew.
They did know.
Yes,
about
we
it.
knew.
Did you know that the Jews were being gassed?
Yes, we heard it. Yes,
Uh-huh.
but I can't tell you who told this. But my husband heard a lot when he worked on the hospitals, and
How did you react to something like that?
you couldn't do anything.
There's nothing you could do.
No. No. All the Jews I knew were already away. No. No.
So there was nobody you knew that was still here. They had all gone, basically.
basically, yes, I knew no one, but still there were Jews, and they had the sign.
Mhm.
But no,
Did you just feel that you were kind of helpless in this situation to do anything to stop this from happening?
no, you could not do anything. You could hide them, but you had help in the house, still help in the house. And we had too much people around because we had the practice at home too. So it was, you couldn't do anything.
I've seen that tape so many times, it's still painful to watch for me. I won't play any more, but you can see how, what are we doing here? You can see how she kind of squirms around. There's another one where she goes like this, wipes on her glasses, and she says they were gone. And so she's very uncomfortable with even talking about it. It's a very painful interview. But you could see a little bit of her image that there's very passive, very helpless. There wasn't anything I could do, very low in efficacy. Worldview is very fatalistic. Nothing I can do. These were things just bigger than I was. Lack of agency and no choice because of no ability to help because she had help in the house. In the earlier clip, told why she had a good life because she was able to be spoiled because she had help. So the two kind of all went together. And of course, many people worked with their help, their servants, the people who worked in their home, to hide people. So that it was a totally wrong explanation. So let's just wrap up and come back to our original puzzle. Does everyone have an ethical perspective? Yes, I think they do. The differences are critical. How you see the world. John sees what the goal of life is to be happy. Beatrix wants to have a good life where she can play squash and tennis. Very different ethical results. Are there ethical implications of how we categorize others? And if we all categorize, then how does this process work? The story with Chloe and her snails, I think, is relevant because it helps me understand how the Nazis saw. I can show you something from a woman named Florentine, who was the Nazi I interviewed, and they were really again, like cockroaches coming into her house, so you had to get rid of them. And I think the way in which the categorization helps is that you incorporate key values into your sense of yourself, and that effectively creates boundaries in your self-image that limit and foreclose debate about transgressing those values. The clip I showed you about Marion, who says we all have memories of times when we wished we'd done something we didn't, and it gets in your way during the rest of your life. I showed this clip into a class, and at the end of the course, on the bottom of the exam was written, I was doing a lot of drinking and partying when I took this course. It sounded like a fun course, and you showed a clip of this woman. She relates to that clip, and then she said, and then you said it's never too late. And she said, it was like a door opened, and I realized I didn't have to go on acting this way. And she said, I've gotten real serious about my studies. I don't drink and party that much anymore. And I thought that was really nice. Someone who was a rescuer and was 18 or 19 and was able to help this other 18 or 19-year-old. So that's basically... I'm going to stop here because I think it's more fun if people have some questions. I have a lot more videos I can show you, and I'm happy to talk about anything. But basically, I think it's the sense of who you are in relation to other people that has tremendous value and impact on your life in the same way that if you're on a computer menu and it doesn't have a certain program, you go into a restaurant, it's a Japanese restaurant, you want to have spaghetti bolognese, not going to be on the menu. So think about who you are, because I think your identity, your sense of who you are, is really the most precious thing you have in life. And it will determine how you treat other people and how perhaps they treat you instead. Thank you. Sure, okay.
So we have about 7 minutes for questions. If you'd like to form a line here by the mic and tell us your name, what you're studying, and then feel free to ask any questions that you have in the remaining time.
I never bite anybody, so.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Watson, and I'm no longer a BYU student. But
That's okay.
I'm just wondering if you got a sense of things in their earlier lives that led to these worldviews that they had, and if in ourselves, if there's something we can do to change our worldviews, or in raising our children, if there are things we can do to influence that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they asked me that this morning. I was interviewed on the radio show here. I think that the socialization that you get from your parents, from your teachers, really important. I think it's just critical. What you're taught is the right kind of behavior. So yes, if you have a child, I mean, I have 3 kids, and they always ask questions, and you try to figure out how to discipline. You can't duck things. You can't do a kind of, well, what do you think, when you're dealing with a 4-year-old. And I remember sitting in the car once, and I heard Alex say to Nick, who is the little boy, don't you know, Nick, you can do just about anything you want as long as you don't hurt yourself or somebody else. And I thought, wow, from John Stuart Mill to me to my kids, they've gotten it, So that's kind of what I tried to talk with my kids, to talk with them a lot. I think the other thing that you can do is you have to try to see the humanity in people and sentient beings too. I mean, I think I shouldn't eat meat. I think it's probably, something ideologically I don't think I should do. I do it, but I think there's a lot of things that if you stop and think about in seeing the importance of humanity in other people, it's really hard to treat people badly if you do that. So that's, I think, important for your kids.
Hi, my name is Wes. I'm studying philosophy and business right now. I was just curious, as far as your belief, I guess, about free will and determinism. Do you believe that humans, in essence, that we are determined by our environment, by our situation, that we really have no control over actions, more like a computer type thing? Yeah. We are modeled to produce a certain outcome, or is there a free will in that choice that we can kind of override our natural inclinations to do a certain thing?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that one. That's a big question. I don't think that we never have any choice. I think you do have the opportunity to make decisions. And I think what you have to do is think about who you are, and this is the feedback loop I mentioned, so that what your actions say about you as a person, what that means for you, how it will change you. There's a wonderful passage in War and Peace where Tolstoy, who hated Napoleon, is describing Napoleon walking around after the Battle of Borodino, and he's looking at this carnage, which is, everybody's dead. And he started out with very lofty ideals, and he either has to give up those ideals and go on and try to conquer the world, or he has to pull back, and he has a choice to make. And so I think we all have a choice to make at different points in time about the kind of person we want to be. And once we decide what we want to be as a person, I think then certain things flow from that. So I think the kind of person we are is a kind of, I'm probably more into phenotypes than I am into nature or nurture. I think it's a kind of combination of things. So you put me in the sun and my hair goes 3 shades lighter blonde, and some other people in the audience not going to turn blonde. And I think there's a lot of stuff like that goes on. But I think you just have to think about who you are and what your actions mean for you as a person. And that's really ducking the question. I just don't have a good answer for it.
My name is Michael Shields, and when nations and governments go to war, they often dehumanize the enemy, and you see that a lot, especially in enlisted training, where they train recruits. They are the quick and the dead. You're the quick, they are the dead. How can we counteract that philosophy? Because at a basic level, that helps people survive in combat. But on a bigger level, that's detrimental to the worldview that America represents.
Yeah, that's another hard question. I see you have somebody in fatigues right behind you. I don't know. I've thought a lot about that. I'm probably pretty close to a pacifist myself. I don't know. I study World War II, which is one of the just wars. If you look at even the wars that are deemed most just, though, Civil Wars, won on both sides. World War II was certainly on one side. I don't think many people defend the Nazis. There's tremendous post-traumatic stress disorder. And I just finished a book on how people keep their humanity during war. And all of the interviews, with one tiny exception, nobody talks about the justness of the war, about it was in a better cause. They all just want to go back And they're just, it's such a traumatic thing, they just want to pull away from it. One of the soldiers in the Battle of the Bulge, which was one of the last really bad battles in up near the Ardennes forest, said the enormity of it all tended to reduce everything else in life to a kind of footnote. And I think that people want to live in the footnote. I had a conversation last year at the Radcliffe Institute with a Mexican filmmaker who's married to a Canadian, and he said, in Canada they just watch all these house and garden TV shows with, love it or list it and redo your home. And he said in Mexico nobody can afford to have a home, so they think about big questions like war and things like that. And I was thinking about that later, and I thought, in some way, isn't what we all want is to live in the footnotes, to not have to deal with issues of war. We want to live in a world where we can worry about things like whether our kids' teeth work well, or whether or not we're going to get the next promotion, or whether or not our apple tree is going to have good fruit that year. Those are, what is it that you really want in life? Do you want to be out fighting in battle and thinking about all these big issues? And I think those are interesting questions. Again, I don't really have a lot of answers. I think it probably is necessary if you're going to have a war where people are going to kill people. You demonize the other side. And you look at, I remember reading, my grandfather had a cartoon book from the Spanish-American War, and I was appalled. I read it when I was like 10 or 11, and it was like, they had cartoons from the Spanish, from the Americans, and the Americans were huge and fat and corpulent, and the Spanish were evil, depending on who was drawing the cartoon. And I kind of, wow, both sides thought they were right. And I remember during the first Iraq War, they had everybody was saying, God's on our side. Remember this big thing? And they had an interview with President of the World Council of Churches in Geneva, and they said, whose side do you think God's on? And he said, I think God's on the side of the suffering, and I think that's the best I can do. I don't really. It just happens. And are there just wars? I don't know. It's hard.
My name's Trent. I study environmental science, and I was wondering, how do people view themselves? Like in the interviews that you had, how do people view themselves who were bystanders after the fact? Like, do they live with a lot of regret, and what's their self-image like?
Yeah, I think Beatrice was very typical. That was what was interesting for me. I expected people to say, gee, I really feel bad about it. I wanted to do something, I couldn't, or I didn't do it, and I'm ashamed of myself. Only one person out of about 50 that I did interviews with said that, and I was really struck by that. Everybody said what Beatrix said. Well, there wasn't anything I could do. I wasn't in a situation where I could help. If I'd been in a situation, I would have done something. But people had tremendous denial mechanisms, and they just didn't see that there was anything they could do. So that's a question I can't answer. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jake Tingleson, and I'm a psychology major.
Sure.
But I'm taking a ethical philosophy class, and it seemed to me like a lot of the people here that said that there wasn't anything I could do, I had to help them because they're people too. Yeah. It almost sounds like in a lot of the philosophies that we talk about, people have this right, to where, well, I don't need necessarily, it's not required of me to volunteer my life for somebody else. That's not something that I feel like pretty generally no moral, ethical philosophy says that you have to give up your life for somebody else. Right. But these people would argue against that. They said, what else could I do? Right. I didn't have a right to not be involved. So with that as the introduction, my question is, what would you say is the ideal ethical philosophy?
I have a course on ethics that I start by showing a film clip where it's a couple, I think, in Holland, and they have a baby that's born earlier than full term, and they have all sorts of life and death decisions. Do you do this? Do you not do that? And they go through the whole thing, and the babies survive, but then they go on and they have serious health problems. And at the end they say, what would you do? And then they talk about, this was how Kantian philosophy would work. And then they say, well, if you're utilitarian philosophy, you would say, don't waste any resources on these kids. Take the money, give it to, 20,000 kids. The amount of money will buy mosquito nettings and keep them alive. The students just go crazy. Oh, no, you can't. And so depending on which philosophical system you choose to follow, you're going to get really different answers to the same question. And I think it's very important that we're aware of that. Most of the philosophy in this country, probably most of what you're getting, is what is called recent and contemporary Anglo-American philosophy. Sometimes it's called recent and contemptuous Anglo-American philosophy. But it's very, Dworkin, H.L.A. Hart, maybe not Hart so much, but people who are of that tradition, Rawls. And I think the alternative philosophy that is not taught very much here is virtue ethics, which talks not about rules, what you call deontological ethics. I'm sure you know all these terms. I never knew them before. And it says don't necessarily think about trying to develop rules like the Ten Commandments or the Torah, things like that, but think about what your actions say about the kind of person you'll be. And then that will give you a different decision-making mechanism. And so that's really, I don't have anything more to say about that because I think the ethical systems are quite different. And I don't know enough about ethical systems in non-Western context. I'm like most people in this country, was educated, starting with Plato and on up through Kant and, Rawls and people like that. And I think some of these other ethical systems are really fascinating and I just don't know enough about them. Yes.
Hi, my name is Drew. I'm a business major. In terms of just being able to recognize the humanity in other people, do you think that's something that people are born with but kind of lose as they get caught up in themselves, or is it a muscle that we kind of have to develop on our own?
That's an interesting question, too. I think there's a lot of interesting work going on now as to whether or not there's an innate predisposition. There was a whole group of philosophical theory called moral sense theory, which came around. It was Adam Smith's teacher, Shaftesbury, Hutchison. You're nodding, you know about some of these people. And that argued that just as we have an appreciation for, we have the sense of touch, we have the sense of sight, smell, things John Widener was talking about. So we have an ethical sense, and that ethical sense can vary so that you may like sauerkraut and I may dislike it, or you may be able to see and I'm blind and can't. But we still have an innate moral sense, and how that is developed is dependent on the society around us and the people around us, but that there is a kind of innate predisposition that people have towards certain kinds of things. Having had 3 children, I think I'm much more in that camp than I was before. But I mean, my oldest son is just always going to be more rebellious, and my second son is he was happy. I mean, he's the only person I know that's really not neurotic in some way. I mean, everybody else I know has some problems, including all of the other members of the family. My daughter's just very shy and very gentle, and she's just always been that way. So how does that get worked on? How does it get modified by the environment around it? Man, I don't really think we know too much about it. There's someone named Josh Green, I was telling Wayne before, I think, they've done experiments with MRIs where they put people in and they give them the trolley experiment, which is if you're there, you see a trolley car going, if it continues on the track, it's going to kill 4 people. You can push a fat man on it and that'll put it onto another track where it won't kill anybody, but it'll kill the fat guy. And that's the initial one. And so they put people in the MRIs and they film what's going on with their brain, and they pose it different ways. They say, will you kill the fat man? And the part of the brain lights up and people say, no, I'm not going to kill anybody. And then when they say, will you pull the lever and kill only 1 person versus 3, it's a different part of the brain that lights up. And his theory is, and he doesn't, it's very incipient, they don't have a lot of good data here, but his theory is that there's a part of the brain that does calculus, literally in the sense of 1 versus 4 is, let's see, that's 1, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, that's 3 different, that part of the brain comes out and actually is a different part of the brain. And so if you frame a moral decision in terms, will you kill a man? No, I'm not going to kill anybody. But will you kill 1 person versus 4? It's a different part of the brain. So I suspect that it's possible we may have some insight into this in about 100 years after we continue doing some of the work on neuroscience and ethics, but it's a very interesting area of study now for those of you who are interested, and I encourage you to go into it. There's a lot of work at Caltech being done on some of this, Michael Spezio, some other people doing it. Yes?
First off, I'd like to thank you for coming in today. My name is Caleb Wilson. I'm studying political science here. And so you mentioned cognitive dissonance earlier. And you talked about how a person can hold themselves in very high regard morally, but still be guilty of some horrible things. And so I just was wondering what your thoughts are on the fact that in the West, and particularly in the United States, we look back on genocide with great horror because they dehumanized and killed people, but yet we can be so accepting of abortion.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Someone also raised that at one of my talks, and I have to get a little technical here. Genocide is killing people because they belong to a particular species or a group. It has nothing to do with them. So technically, abortion cannot be a genocide because it's a member, assuming that it is life at only 3 months, which is what the law says we can do for abortion, then it wouldn't be genocide. It's something different. Now, that may be murder, and that you may be equally repelled by it, but it isn't technically genocide because it would be genocide if you gave abortion to all babies of one particular group. But you don't know, you can't know about the parentage for sure with babies. So I don't think that abortion would be genocide. Is abortion wrong? That's one of these questions. I personally think that it should be a woman's choice at a certain point. I don't think a child can live outside the body. But having said that, I've had 3 children. There's no way I could have had an abortion. I just couldn't do it. It would be something that I couldn't do. I was 47 when my daughter was born. At that point, the odds that I was going to have a Down syndrome child or have some serious birth defect were 1 in 20, which is pretty not great odds. I'd had bleeding during the pregnancy early on, so when they did the amnio, it took them longer, and so I was at 21 weeks before they told me that Chloe was fine, and I wasn't going to abort that baby. I didn't really care. My mother was sure that Nicholas was going to be have some serious deformation. She was going to, sell her house and devote her whole life to taking care of this baby. And when Nicholas was 4, she finally told me this, and I said, on the one hand, it's very sweet. On the other hand, you're nuttier than a fruitcake. I mean, Mother, look at him. He's smart. He's okay. So I think people can have really different public policy positions and have different personal positions on this. There are certain things in life you just hope you never have to go there. And I'm just lucky I never had to face that decision. But I think that is an issue of many of the political issues. I can actually see both sides of it. And I respect people who say, and I think they're just like the rescuers. I mean, I don't condone it, but I can understand the psychology behind people who will risk their lives in bombing an abortion clinic or something, because that's in some ways what the rescuers were doing. Now, the fact that they may be killing somebody else in the clinic, I think that complicates things. But I can see both sides of that issue. I think it's a very complicated moral issue, and I think it's an issue on which reasonable people can disagree, unlike a lot of other political issues that I don't feel that way about. So that's, again, I don't have a black and white answer. I don't think abortion's a black and white question. It's a very difficult question, and I think as medical science gets more and more advanced, we're going to have more and more issues that we have to face like that. Thank you all for having me. I really enjoyed being here.